Okay, so this presentation is a science presentation. So the only great way that I can think to start is with an experiment. For the next 20 seconds, you're going to see a white cross appear up on the screen, and I want you to stare at that cross and leave your mind completely at rest. Ready, set, go. All right, how was that? Was your brain completely at rest, or did your mind begin to wander? For most of us, our minds are never at rest, and we're always thinking about something, whether it's what we want for lunch or a fact about one of the presentations we saw earlier. For the last 2 years, I've worked in a brain imaging lab at Mass General Hospital, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about what people think about. If you came to visit me in Boston and we repeated that same task in a brain scanner, we would see that your brain is definitely not resting. It's full of activity all the time. Today, scientists are using a technique called resting state analysis to learn more about the intrinsic and low frequency signals that permeate our brain activity even when our minds are at rest. This sort of resting state analysis has huge potential, and there's studies out there that suggest that if we better understand resting state, we will better understand the types of things going on in the brain in diseases like schizophrenia and depression and PTSD. Scientists are still struggling to figure out how exactly resting state signals should be interpreted, but this sort of discovery has huge potential to really change the way we think about the human brain. One great way to better understand what resting state signal really is starts with thinking about your brain as a tree. Now, this isn't a new idea. In 1894, a Spanish neuroscientist named Santiago Ramon y Cajal gave a presentation before the Royal College of Physicians. And during that presentation, he used an extended metaphor to explain that neurons are like trees. He said as they grow and develop, they branch out and they make new connections. And Cajal was the first person to examine neurons under a microscope. And you can see that he's pretty artistic as well. Some of his drawings were really intricate, and you can see them here. And at a quick glance, that's all you need to see that these neurons really do look a lot like trees. Now, if you combine neurons together and you look at all billion of them, several hundred billion of them that are in your brain starts to look like a large forest, a massive forest, and it seems to act like one too. Just as Cajal first hypothesized, our neurons do sprout new branches as they grow and develop. And like a hurricane or a forest fire, diseases like Alzheimer's can blaze through, obliterating branches and destroying entire neurons in their wake. Cajal's tree metaphor gives us a great way to think about the structure of the brain, but when we want to learn more about mind wandering, we want to think about brain activity. One tool that we use to learn more about brain activity and to measure brain activity is called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. In an fMRI scan, we use a large, powerful magnet to create a video of your brain activity. And when your mind is at rest, that video of activity looks something like this. You can see the pixels fluctuating in and out and flickering very quickly. And then to make sense of all this noisy data, we use a state-of-the-art computer to summarize brain activity in a single image. We shade in regions of the brain that seem to be acting in sync. Now, we could color those regions any color we wanted in our whole beautiful rainbow, which we are all very familiar with. But instead, we choose usually to use the color orange. And the color orange comes from the first fMRI paper, which was published just after Halloween in 1991. And the editors over at Science thought like, oh, this cover will be so cool with this orange and purpley black background and this skull. It's perfect for Halloween, right? Well, something else that happens to be orange right around Halloween time are the trees in my home state of Massachusetts. And in some respects, we can compare the changing color of leaves in the fall to the changing color of brain activity, changing levels of brain activity when the mind is at rest. We can see this in the picture here. Not all of the trees are the same color. Some are more orange, some are more red, some are still green. And it's the same way in the brain. Some regions will synchronize with other regions and become more active. Other regions will stay less active at the same time. When we're analyzing a brain like this, we typically pick what's called regions of interest. And I've labeled those here on this brain with red dots. Here, there's a brain with 34 regions of interest. And if we analyze the signal that comes from each of these regions, we can look at which regions are in sync, which regions are out of sync. And in a way, this is like we're looking at the brain like it's a forest. And each of these regions is its own tree. Some of the regions might be red trees, and they're sort of acting the same way. Other regions might be orangey trees acting the same way. The regions might not be anywhere near each other, but they're connected in this sort of functional way. Now, we know these patterns exist in the brain, but how are they altered? Could a mental illness alter these resting state patterns? So I came up with a study to try and answer this question. We gave a computer 65 different brains to look at. Half of them had a mental illness called schizophrenia. The other half were matched controls. The first thing the computer did was create a standard model for each of the two groups. So on the left, we have our standard model of schizophrenia, and on the right, we have our standard model of the resting state signals in the matched controls. Second, we gave the computer a new brain that it had never seen before. And we said, look at this brain, analyze the same patterns that you're looking at, and then make a decision. And the computer would decide this brain is either schizophrenic or it's a matched control. And then the last thing we do is we check. We see, okay, yes, the computer made the correct decision. Now, we repeated this process with all 65 brains, and the computer came up with a category for each brain. And then we double-checked the computer's work, and we said, okay, the computer got the right answer about 78% of the time, just by examining the resting state patterns in the brain. Now, this implies that there are detectable differences between these two groups in the resting state activity. But really, this study leaves us with more questions than it does answers. Resting state activity can differ based on what people are thinking about, and we have no idea what these people might have been thinking about. It can also differ from antipsychotic drugs, and a lot of people with schizophrenia are prescribed these kinds of drugs that could alter their brain activity. Last, there's always motion. People move their heads around in an fMRI scanner, and that can really affect the signal that we're getting. It's possible that people with a mental illness or normal controls, one of those groups might have a harder time sitting still. So, because of all of these confounds and considerations, a lot of scientists wonder if fMRI is really the right tool to be using when we're studying the mind at rest. In fact, many neuroscientists argue that you cannot learn anything from the mind at rest because you just can't design an experiment that is a controlled experiment. There's too many confounding variables coming at you from all directions. No matter how difficult this work may be, I think that it's very important to continue studying the resting mind. Let's remember back to that cross that you saw at the beginning and the thoughts that were coming through your head. Your brain conjured up those thoughts with no instruction and no stimulus all on its own. And that's amazing in and of itself. But your resting brain is like a race car revving its engine. It's a haven for creativity and for disjointed ideas to sort of collide and mesh together. Think about what occupies your mind when you're sitting at home and not thinking of anything else. What are those problems you can't stop wondering about? Those things you just keep thinking about. Maybe you're an electrical engineer and you are really interested in music, and all you can think about is how to design the perfect noise-canceling headphones. Or maybe you're a civil engineer and you spent a semester abroad in Italy and now you're back and you have the perfect bridge design that you just can't stop thinking about. Or maybe you're like me. I'm from a town in Massachusetts called Braintree. And whenever I'm riding home on the subway and I'm staring off into space, watching the tracks go by, I'm thinking about the name of my hometown. And when I think about the words Braintree, I'm inspired to think differently about the human brain.